We're back. You already know what time it is. It's R3's time, where we read. I'm Naila, I'm your CEO, and I'm your founder of R3, Real Eyes, Real Lives, Real Lives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. And what better way to do that than to read, write, and comprehend with your own understanding? So, of course, we're getting back into African Glory. It's the history of vanished Negro civilizations by J.C. deGraft Johnson. Of course, this is an excellent read for any reader that needs a quick glimpse of the history of Africa, because it is extensive. But what better way to do that than to read? So just a recap of the book, it is an important book of deals with a fascinating period of world history, which is little known to the general reader. And most books on African history concentrate on the colonization of Africa and on the institutions developed by European missionaries, traders, technicians, and colonial administrators. So Dr. deGraft Johnson, drawing upon many sources, gives a vivid account of pre-colonial Africa, and in the course of his studies, due to recognition, is accorded at the last to the accomplishments of the Negroes themselves. So we've been learning about it so far, but I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to our hostess with the mostest. She's going to let you know a little bit more on how to find us, what she can do next, and we are going to jump right into chapters 11, 12, and 13, and we'll begin with the end of the West African empires. See you soon.
Hey, I was over here. We're at R3 Real Lives. We're here every Tuesdays at 3. Right now, we're reading African Glory by Johnson. I can't remember the first C. Is it C?
J.C. deGraft. Yes.
Oh, wait. Oh, I got it completely off. I'm sorry. Let me start all over. I was over here at R3 Real Lives, where we meet every Tuesdays at 3. And we're reading African Glory by deGraft. We are here at 3 o'clock. You can see us at TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, and at the website at R3 Real Lives. Will get you to all 4 of those places. And we're also on
YouTube.
Thank you. On YouTube. I told you I was going to mess that up. So let me start all over at R3 Real Lives at YouTube, TikTok, Facebook, and Instagram. And you get the website where you can like, share, and follow for free on all of the platforms. And you can also donate at the R3 Real Lives website, where you can donate to different campaigns that we have going on, homeless initiatives, scholarships, and the like. Again, we're reading at our African Glory, and we're going over chapters 11, 12 today. One more chapter, I believe, 10, 11, 12, or 12, 11, 13. That was a weird order. But going over those where our CEO will read to us, and you can like, share, and follow, and comment on the website. Do we have a line in there today? If you're there every Tuesday, mostly. If not, we'll see you next time in line. But again, at R3 Real Lives, every Tuesday at 3. So we're going to get started because we don't have a lot of time today. Back to you, kid.
We still have 30 minutes, so that's good. Okay, so we'll go ahead and start with chapter 11, which speaks about the end of West African empires. So, of course, we talked about Askia the Great, who named himself, actually. But Askia the Great, and at the end of his reign, we're going to talk about in the beginning of chapter 11 how Ishmael, he did not long survive his father, Askia the Great. He ended up dying later in 1543. So this chapter starts off with that. And, of course, the succession of Daud, D-A-U-D. But we want to speak about a little bit of the fall of the African empires is very significant in this chapter because it highlights the issue that we still have in the African diaspora today, and it's perfidy, which is basically the betrayal of your own people against you. So we see that in the Songhai army, and if you know about the Songhai army, we've been reading how great this army was to defend itself in the capitals of Timbuktu and Gao, and also Djenné, D-J-E-N-N-E. So the fall of these cities actually came to their own people itself, turning on Askia Ishak II, which is a succession, or the person who succeeded Askia the Great, which succeeded by Askia Ishak I, which Daud succeeded Ishak in 1549 and became Askia Daud, D-A-U-D. One thing about Daud I wanted to put on record on page 110, how he maintained the martial spirit of his ancestors, and within a very short time he had gone to war with the Maasai, with the Fulani of Messina, and had picked a quarrel with Kebbi and Katsina in northern Nigeria. So clearly you can see that the conflicts in between the African continent itself actually grew to the destruction of the West African empires, or the end of the West African empires, and basically putting the colonizer or the Europeans or the French that we'll learn in chapter 12 into the hands of them and pushing each other aside. So we're just going to kind of read around in the quotes. Page 111, we're going to jump over to the third paragraph. Let's see here. Well, we'll start on page 110. I'll read briefly there. So, Dod succeeded Ishak in 1549 and became Askia Dod. He maintained the martial spirit of his ancestors, and within a very short time he had gone to war with the Maasai, with the Fulani of Messina, and had handpicked a quarrel with Kebbi and Katsina in northern Nigeria. Askia Dod was so sure of the courage and fighting ability of his subjects that he sent a raiding party of 24 horsemen to attack the city of Katsina. These resolute men hurled themselves at 400 Katsina horsemen who had come out to meet them, needless to say. Dod's men were overpowered. 15 of them were killed in the struggle, and the remaining 9, being wounded, were quickly captured. But the ruler of Katsina sent them back to Askia Dod with this message: men of such incomparable valor do not deserve to die. Okay, so Askia Dod maintained his martial ardor, and he was soon sacking Busa and invading the Mali kingdom, routing the Mandingo army in 1555. So if we jump down on page 111, the third paragraph, it says that this brought peace at last, and there were no further trouble from Morocco for 21 years. There were no trouble from Morocco. So right, if you put into your mind now, if you were reading with us, Morocco is the invading army at this time, trying to overtake the Songhai Empire, which is one of the last reigning empires of West Africa. So it says, but in August 1578, Europe received from Morocco news so grave that it profoundly shocked the whole of Christendom. How could something affecting Europe ultimately affect the destiny of West Africa? And that is a question that I want to put in the mind of the reader, that how could something affecting Europe ultimately affect the destiny of West Africa? And mind you, at this time, Europe, uncivilized, well, I like to say, was dealing with the Civil War and clashing in between its own, and also trying to overtake people and put them into Christianity. So if you think about that question, it's because how could something affecting them cause anything to affect Africa, which is a continent? So early in 1578, Sultan Muhammad the 11th, sometimes called the Black Sultan because of his color, appealed to Dom Sebastian, King of Portugal, to help him recover the throne, which his uncle Abdul Malik had usurped. And the Sultan Muhammad, this on page 111, the last paragraph, second sentence. Sultan Muhammad the 11th had promised Dom Sebastian a permanent foothold on the Moroccan coast, and it was this promise which made Europe more than usually interested in the campaign. Dom Sebastian landed at Tangiers with 17,000 men. And if you know about the Tangiers, you should know about the Battle of Tangiers in Algeria. We can watch the movie. I'll actually post it later. It's actually a very good movie to watch about a later battle that happened, but it was in the Tangiers. So I highlighted that because that's very important to understand and know. So if you jump over to page 112, again, we're speaking of the end of the West African empires. Third paragraph, first sentence, it says, who was to ascend the throne of Morocco? The choice fell on a younger brother, Abdul Malik, a man barely 30, the man who was one day to seal the fate of the West African empires. So this is where Queen Elizabeth I, which is actually Queen Elizabeth that we know that recently passed, she's Queen Elizabeth II. This is her great cousin. Go down the line. She's a cousin several times removed. Okay. So on the third paragraph, last sentence, it says, for in 1577, Queen Elizabeth of England had secretly attempted to negotiate a treaty with Morocco. And again, this is where you see again the entering of the colonists that are trying to take over Africa by causing disarray in between the continent itself, right? So Queen Elizabeth is trying to secretly negotiate a treaty with Morocco, and the young Sultan of Morocco, El Mansour, had received a supply of English timber for shipbuilding. And remember, we came on ships, they came on ships as well, right? So she immediately is trying to take over Africa by, sending products and sending timber so that they can build ships, right? So then on the last paragraph there, we'll just read here. This is also a highlight from my grandfather I caught, but we'll read here. El Mansour now wanted to give his soldiers something to do, but not even Queen Elizabeth could tempt him to risk a clash with Spain. Where could El Mansur implore his soldiers? The obvious answer was the Songhai Empire. El Mansur summoned his council of war and put the project before them. There was complete silence. The Sultan pressed for an answer. Then pandemonium broke out. The council protested that such a project had never been undertaken in the whole course of history. It was insanely reckless. The very desert would swallow up the soldiers. It was sheer suicide. And so this is just speak about the quarrel that is happening right now in Morocco. Well, then in Morocco, between the Queen trying to infiltrate and do a treaty with Morocco, but also the Songhai Empire trying to hold on to their power. So if we jump over on page 113, we'll read from the second paragraph on page 113. Second to last sentence. The cannonballs and other munitions had largely been supplied by Queen Elizabeth of England. So ready were the Europeans to enlist in this Moroccan army that Spanish became its official language. Even the command of the army went to a Spanish eunuch named Judar Pasha. So Judar Pasha is going to become very relevant soon in overtaking and causing the final end of West African empires, the Songhai Empire to be exact. But it's just interesting to me that the Europeans were so ready to take over that Spanish became their main language. And that also brings me back to what we said last week, how if you think in a context, in Mexico, for instance, they speak Spanish. Those are descendants of people in Spain, right? So just keep that in mind when you're thinking about the language. And also it relates to the colonist or the oppressor at the time. So any language of a people relates to the oppressor or the colonist at the time, whichever name so fits you. So Pasha enters the scene, right? So we're going to jump over to 114, second paragraph, third to last sentence. We'll read to the bottom, but this is where the destruction and perfidy of Africa itself, West Africa itself, caused its own destruction and betrayal between its own people. The Songhai army had no guns, and even though firearms had been introduced into Bornu sometime earlier, the Songhai soldiers had no knowledge of their use of Judar Pasha's forces. However, were well supplied with firearms, including cannons. So they had no ideas about these guns and these weapons. But I thought it was very interesting that they still were able to hold their front, I guess you would call it. They were still able to hold their front by using tactics of guerrilla warfare, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And so the last sentence actually on this page 114, it kind of gives us that outlook. So the invading troops attacked the Songhai Empire at a time when the Guinea coast was facing the full rigors of the slave trade era. Peace and prosperity had prevailed in the heart of the African continent before Judar Pasha attacked. Then followed anarchy, plundering, and depreciation. The Jene, Gaou, and Timbuktu were sacked, pillaged, and burnt to the ground. So remember, we talked about Timbuktu being one of the major places of education for Europe, but also for the continent of Africa. And that actually being, in fact, the University of Sankore, or Sankore, I should say. So they burnt it all down to the ground. And then a lot of the books and things actually ended up in Morocco. So have you. Thievery at its best, right? So on page 116, this is where the fall of the end of the African empire actually is really taking place. So, and it was described as one of the worst acts of perfidy ever perpetrated by Africans to Africans themselves. And it just makes me think of Queen Kahina, which we talked about earlier in North Africa, how she was the last standing defense to keep Africa for Africans. And the fact that she died and her son took over and ended up going over into being a Muslim. And now we have entering on the scene one of the worst acts to ever be done by Africans against themselves. It just shows you how sometimes greed, ambition, betrayal, and envy can take over a continent very easily by giving it to the colonists because you prefer not to have it yourself with your own people or those that look like you. So keep that in mind. It's on page 116. We'll speak about Mahmoud bin Zergan. So the second paragraph says, Mahmoud bin Zergan, known as Mamun Pasha, arrived in Timbuktu where Judar Pasha had retired, and there took over command of Moroccan army from Judar Pasha. The conflict was intensified. Askia Ishak II made ready to oppose Mahmoud Pasha, but when they met, the Songhai army had to retreat in haste, making its way southward into the western Dendeni. And the ungrateful Songhai army turned on their emperor, Askia Ishak II, who narrowly escaped being assassinated. They literally turned on him at the brink of war. He tried to reach Kebi near Lake Chad, but circumstances compelled him to place himself at the mercy of Gurma, who had been long hated by the Songhai rule, and he and his companions were all murdered. The ingratitude of the Songhai people to Askia Ishak II will go down in history as one of the worst acts of perfidy ever perpetrated by Africans. Ishak's chamberlain Muhammad Gao was elected emperor, but the choice so angered the leading men of Songhai that they at once went over to the side of the enemy. So this is where you see the division of the Africans themselves on the continent, just choosing the opposite side. So if we jump over to page 1, oh, and then also I wanted to read, this is also how they caused the great split. The last paragraph here, it says, we'll read from the third to last sentence, but no sooner had the Askia arrived than he and his companions were treacherously seized and sent by boat as prisoners to Judar Pasha at Gao. Remember I said this is where the fall enters in with Pasha. So a messenger was sent to the Sultan at Morocco to find out what should be done to the Askia. But long before the messenger returned, Askia and his companions had been murdered and a puppet had been installed as Askia. From then on, there were two Askias. One, a puppet, the Askia of the north, and the other, the accepted ruler of the Songhai people, the Askia of the south. And so this enters in the brilliant leader Nuh, N-U-H. He's the younger brother of the ruler Askia Muhammad of Gao, who was murdered by his own people. So this is on page 117, and we'll just read the fourth sentence down. Here Askia Nuh carried out a vigorous guerrilla campaign and showed, as has been demonstrated in our day in Malay and in the French Indochina, that it is possible for an inadequately equipped army to stand up in a jungle country to the best equipped and best trained soldiers of the world, provided they can avoid open conflict. But that also brought to me to mind not only them, but the Jamaicans going to the mountains and fighting off, and also in Haiti being able to use guerrilla warfare tactics regardless of what the enemy had. They had guns, but we had knowledge of self, our resources, our environment, and to be able to use that guerrilla warfare and attacking them, which we're going to actually learn about really quick, because I thought that was quite brilliant. So on page 117, it also says, Lord Lugard, writing of a similar guerrilla tactics employed at a later date in precisely similar, if not identical country, attributes their success to two causes. First, to the reputation for a knowledge of witchcraft and of deadly poison, which renders their poison arrow very dreaded. Mind you, I said Haiti. A lot of people speak about Haiti and having the Orishas with them, or Ubatala with them, and having that witchcraft, as the colonizer would say, or the oppressor would say. But they use the knowledge of themselves and knowledge of their resources in order to defeat their enemies. So that brought me to mind Lord Lugard's writings. So we'll continue reading. It says, second, to their fighting tactics, so far from dreading to separate their forces, their custom, I am told when they attack by day, it is to make a feint of attack simultaneously on front and rear, reserving the bulk of their strength for a strong attack on the center of a long caravan. This mode of attack by ambush would generally succeed in dividing their enemies' forces and inducing panic. They, however, love most to effect a night surprise. So right there, they're attacking from the front and the back. They take their time to recuperate. Then they attack the center with all of their strength. And then they do it at night also, defeating the enemy, but also catching the enemy off guard and making them miserable to the point where they win, okay? And this is a tactic of guerrilla warfare. But on top of using their witchcraft, quote unquote, their knowledge of self, they also had spears that had deadly poisons on it. So guns were not necessary if you had unity within your army, but also knowledge of the land that you were on. So that's something to always keep in mind. On page 117, we'll read from the last paragraph. The losses suffered by the Moroccan soldiers caused their leaders to adopt harsh measures against the city dwellers of the Songhai Empire, particularly against the scholars of Timbuktu. And that, like I just said, knowledge of self and your resources is the most powerful thing that you can have. It's not the weapons. So immediately the Moroccan soldiers attacked the people who had the knowledge. They attacked all the scholars, the lecturers, the professors, the jurists, the theologians. They were driven in chains to Morocco. All their books were also transported to Morocco. Among those deported was Professor Ahmed Baba, the distinguished historian of Sankore University, so frequently quoted in the Tariq Sudan and other works. Professor Ahmed Baba was not released from his Moroccan prison until 1607, and in that same year he returned to Timbuktu to die. And so we're going to read the connotation because it kind of sums up here. So it says, connotation 1 on page 118. We get a picture of the importance attached to learning in the Songhai Empire from a statement made by Professor Ahmed Baba while he was a prisoner in Morocco. He is reported to have said, "Of all my friends in the Sudan, it was I who owned the smallest library, but I profess 1,600 volumes." That's it. So 1,600 volumes. He had the smallest library, but this was the issue that they were attacking them on, is the knowledge of self, the knowledge of resources, educated. And remember, Timbuktu was the largest center of learning for not only Europe, but the African continent. So on page 119, we'll finish off. It says, the invaders and their descendants were absorbed into the huge mass of the Negro populations. The conquest had spent itself. It had been destroyed but never created. And in a place of the old West African empires, there was found an atomized group of peoples ready to jump at each other's throats and to sell each other into the slave markets. So people always ask about who came to get us after we were put on slave ships and who sold us in the first place. We sold ourselves due to greed. That's exactly what this chapter is describing. Conflict in between ourselves, not being able to unify over a common goal. Like Queen Kahina said, keeping Africa for Africans. We sold ourselves into the slave market just so that we could profit off of it, which is happening still to this day. You see the capitalists, or you see the richer people, the famous people, they will sell themselves off in order to compromise the few, the 99% against the 1%. We'll put it like that. So at the last sentence, it says, by the beginning of the 19th century, it had become impossible to distinguish the Moroccans from the original Negro population. Once more, Africa had swallowed up an invader, but at a terrible cost to itself. That brings me into, a lot of people speak about interracial dating, interracial relationships, mixed children, the one-drop rule. All of this comes from honestly, it comes from wanting to be like the oppressor. We learned that in another book we read about Frantz Fanon, The Psychology of the Black Man, and wanting that close proximity always to the white man or the oppressor, so much to the point that we are willing to sell ourselves. We're willing to intermarry with them and have children with them in order to be closer to them. So this will brought the downfall of the West African empires to the point where the Negro, the black people, became indistinguishable even to this day to themselves. We still don't know who we are. And that's on page 119. So if we jump over to chapter 12. Chapter 12 spoke about the prelude to West African discoveries. But I won't read too much there. I wanted to point out a few things. So this is funny where, the colonizers said they discovered something that was already there, or how Christopher Columbus is known how to discover the world, right? To sail the ocean blue, but he wasn't the first. So that's very important to put into retrospect, because Mansa Musa actually set out sail. He traveled around Africa. He showed all of the gold and the glitz and the glam of the splendor of the African continent, right? But then you have some of these people that enter into the record, and this is kind of where slavery is taken into play, is what I got. So we have on page 120, the last sentence, the colonists moved further and further south until they reached Rio de Oro, where Hanno founded a Carthaginian settlement. This settlement was named Kerne, and it represented the southernmost Carthaginian trading colony. The Moors still call the place Herne. And then the second paragraph, after Hannu's West African venture, there's a record of a Greek by the name of Euthymius who visited the coast of West Africa between 400 and 300 BC. Euthymius is said to have discovered the Senegal River, which is weird because it was already there and people already inhabited the land. So he didn't discover anything. He merely stumbled upon something that was already there and probably named by its own people. But he named it Chrometes. And about 100 years later, Polybus, another Greek explorer and historian, visited the same coast. Polybus described several West African rivers, among them Gambia, which he said was full of crocodiles. He called it the Gambian River. He called the Gambian River Bambutus, and most probably he based the name on the fact that the Mandingo tribe, the Mandingo micronation, I like to call them, their word for crocodile is actually bamboo. So he just stole a word and said that he named it. So on page 129, the last sentence, this is where we actually find the rift in between the colonizers themselves. A lot of times, like I said, they talk about Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue, or the European being the first to colonize Africa, as if that's a victory. But it was actually the French, and we see that entered in on page 121. It says the seafaring exploits of Frenchmen like Jean de Rouen led to the formation in Normandy of a trading company whose main subject was trade with West Africa. The company consisted of merchants from Dieppe and Rouen, and it sent out 4 vessels to explore and colonize the coast of West Africa. And we'll jump down to the second paragraph, second sentence. The official historians of the colonial office does not even refer to the French claim to have been the first Europeans in comparatively modern times to explore the coast of West Africa. The historian of the Gold Coast government dismisses the French claim in these words: the European pioneers on the Gold Coast were the Portuguese, unless the flimsy evidence of a French landing a century later is accepted. The Portuguese first reached the coast in 1471, and in 1482 began to form settlements where they remained for the next 160 years. So if we jump down the last paragraph, it kind of explains that one may argue that if the French had made such an amazing discovery, why then did they neglect such a rich find, more particularly La Mine d'Or? The answer is simple. France became involved in civil war, and in war with England, the 100 Years' War sapped her vitality and strength, and when the long draw-out struggle was over, the French sea power was practically destroyed. So again, the colonizer fighting amongst themselves destroyed one another and refuses to give the other colonizers the claim to destroying Africa first. Thought that was interesting that they actually battle who was first when they all did the same thing when they came. So let's see. Okay, on page 125, second paragraph, we'll read, it says, it was clear that Europe was out to gain control of North Africa, either by sword, as was the case with the capture of Damietta in 1219, or by means of the Bible, as with St. Francis of Assisi and other evangelists. And that brings me over to, we're going to read from the Bible, if I can get it in there. I'm glad I reached it. So we're going to read from the Bible, John chapter 21, and then I'll read the reference to you. A lot of times people don't actually, that are religious, don't actually bring up the history of religion. They just bring up their belief in the religion. So we're going to read from John chapter 21, verse 22. And if you know John, John is one of the most beloved 12 prophets of Jesus, followers of Jesus. And also he was told to him, Jesus told him and Peter, I believe, the fishing story. I don't want to get too much into it. We're just going to read from it. But this is when, come on, I'm trying to bring it up. Okay, it's John chapter 21. I don't want this version. Hold on. So again, we're going to be on page 125. 21, 22. From the New Testament. We'll read. And this just shows you also how religion was used to captivate the mind of the Africans, as well as anybody, the Muslims that were there, in order to sway them into their belief to take power over those people. So that's just very interesting to me that we're going to make a reference here. So on page 125, I'll read while it's coming up. We do not know whether the intense missionary zeal of Europeans during this period was due to a desire to penetrate further south and to link up with a mythical Christian king named Prester, or Presbyter John, who was supposed to rule who was supposed to rule a kingdom to the south of the Sahara. But it was believed that this Prester John was none other than the Apostle John, which is why I said I'm going to read from there. We have 10 minutes left. And again, it says south of the Sahara. So what would be south of Sahara? If the Sahara is up north, according to our maps now, south of the Sahara would be down further. So if you kind of put yourself where we just came from, actually, how is so, Mom? Ethiopia, and south of that would be Sudan. So if you think about that, and that's where actually you find the darker skinned Africans, the one that are almost haven't mixed in with the colonizers so much. So that's where we are in this chapter. And it speaks about, it said, but it was believed that this Prester John was none other than the Apostle John. The idea was fantastic, yet the desire to locate Prester John was to persist for centuries. Why should anyone suppose that Prester John was the Apostle John and that he could live for centuries? And the answer is found on John 21, chapter 22. And I'll just read a little bit before that because that's important to give you context. Let's see if it's going to come up. And I'm just pulling this. So this is where I was saying Jesus and the miraculous catch of the fish. But we're not going to read too much. We're going to go down when he reinstates Peter. Here we go. Okay, I can read that. Okay, so it's we'll read from John chapter 21, verse 15 down to 22. It says, when they had finished eating, Jesus said to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, he said. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my lambs. Chapter 16, again, Jesus said, Simon, son of John, do you love me? He answered, yes, Lord, you know that I love you. Jesus said, take care of my sheep. Verse 17, the third time he said to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him the third time, do you love me? He said, Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Verse 18, very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. And another verse in the Bible, I forget the quote, but it says that Ethiopia will stretch out her hands. So that brought that to my mind. But then verse 19 says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, follow me. Chapter 20. Peter, and that comes from a verse where Jesus is saying, follow me to know me so you don't need me, right? So put that into context, and if you follow the parables of the Bible, you should be able to pick that up. But verse 20 says, Peter turned and saw that the disciple whom Jesus loved was following them. This was the one who had leaned back against Jesus at the supper and had said, Lord, who is going to betray you? If you see that picture of the Last Supper and you see him leaning over, he's asking, Lord, who's going to betray you? And verse 21 says, when Peter saw him, he asked, Lord, what about him? And 22, this is where we'll end. It says, Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is it to you? You must follow me. So we'll end there. And that is because on page 125, this idea was fantastic for Europe to try to Christianize the African continent in search of this Apostle Paul, in search of this Prester John. But the answer is to be found in the New Testament, which we just read. This is on page 125, the last sentence. The answer is to be found in the New Testament, St. John, the 21:22, where one reads the words, if I will that he tarry till I come, what is it to thee? So they thought that this Apostle John was to live forever, but he also thought he was going to be the one to betray Jesus. So it's like, what is it to you if you follow me and I know all things? Do you love me? Do you trust me? That is what is being referenced here in this chapter. I thought that was interesting. And then I just pointed out on page 126, it mentions that here, let's see, the last paragraph, 3 years after the Battle of Quetta, Prince Henry, the navigator, settled at Sagres in extreme southwest of Portugal, overlooking the Atlantic. Here he studied and sent forth men on missions of exploration, and he was to see his nearby Portuguese port of Lagos become world famous as a center from which men were to go out to lay open the mysteries of Africa and the Orient. And if you think about Lagos, Nigeria now being one of the most richest nations now in Africa, put it in the context with the Portuguese. So chapter 13 we won't get to, but that speaks about the Portuguese in West Africa. Christianity was spread throughout Africa with Prince Henry, the navigator. Having now received the support of the church, he carried horses on ships to enable his sailors to hunt down their human prey on the Saharan coast. And that's on page 127. And then let's go back. Let me clear this out, see how much time we have. Let's see. We might stop there. 4 minutes. Okay. And then I just want to enter in on page 127. The Portuguese found a new name for the indigenous African religion. They called it a fetish. And that drew me, that captivated me, because that is what happens now when you, the African people across the diaspora, when we worship or we celebrate or we honor our ancestors, it's always considered witchcraft or fetishes, even from those people who worship religion, Christianity, Islam. If you worship anything like the moon, the sun, and the stars that we talked about last week, that is all put into the form of a fetish, the form of witchcraft, the form of some type of demon or devilish worship, right? So that's where it's entered in by Prince Henry the Navigator. But we're going to end there on chapter 13. We'll kind of pick up next week on chapter 13, because it speaks about Elmina gold mines, and that is a castle in Ghana. Very, very important. That's where a lot of people were shipped off from to the New World. So we'll talk about that later. But I'm Naila. I'm your CEO and your founder. We are reading African Glory, the story of vanished Negro civilizations, but they're not vanished anymore because we just read about them. So you should know about them. I'm going to pass it over to our hostess with the Moses. She'll let you know how to find us, and on YouTube, just a hint. And you can come and play this back later, but we'll see you next week, Tuesdays at 3, until further time changes may happen. You there?
Yes.
Okay, to you.
Hey, it's Howard-So, host of Moses. We are reading or listening to African Glory by deGraft, and chapters 11, 12. And next week we'll do probably 13 through 16. We can reach us here every Tuesdays at 3, and that will be Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And that will also get you to our website, where you can like, share, and follow all those platforms for free. You want to donate to any of the campaigns? We do campaigns, drive-bys to feed the homeless, give them clothing, shoes, socks, and a meal. We also have a scholarship that we are sponsoring. So if you want to donate, we'll take $1, 10, 20, 30, 100,000, 100,000, whatever you fancy, we can take it and we'll go into the community. We are at R3 Real Eyes. I just wanted to make a point, since we are talking about Africa. I am behind on we got 2 minutes reading. Right now, there might be a conflict going on between Somalia and Ethiopia. The Somalians have kicked the Ethiopian army out and invited Egypt in, which Egypt and Ethiopia are at odds with each other, so it might be a conflict, but we're at R3, see you Tuesday at 3. Back to you.
Okay, and I will definitely look into that. You know I'm all about that. So the Sticky Icky Truth may have to bring it to you. But we will see you guys next week at 3. I'm Naila, your CEO and your founder of R3, Real Eyes, Real Lives. Real Eyes, Real Lives, Real Lives, where we promote knowledge of self through education and activism. See you next week. And we say 3. Oh, I was going to get you. Okay, peace. See ya.